Previously on Classroom Hacks.
And so I try to put in some motivational factors into class on a regular basis, because I tell them, I need them too. Life is tough. Life is hard. And so a couple of quotes here just to leave you with. One is from, I can't say his last name correctly, but if you Google the quote, you can find it. He's one of these guys who runs the ultra marathons, like those 100-mile races. And the quote, and now I feel on the spot here, I might butcher the quote, but it's something like, "Run if you can, walk if you must, crawl if you have to, just never give up." And the other one is from a famous acting coach, Russian acting coach, again, whose name is escaping me. I should have been more prepared for this. We're talking probably in the 20th century, maybe even the 19th century, and one of his students asked him, "Do you think I have talent?" And he replied to her, "Never mind talent. Do you have tenacity?"
Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Monday morning, July... What is the date today? Monday morning, July 16th. This is episode 12 of Classroom Hacks, the interview process. You don't want to miss this one. Hope you are seated and ready to listen to some great sage advice about the process of a collegiate interview and some success
we'll try
stories.
to offer great advice.
Yeah, we'll try.
That's the goal. That's our goal anyhow.
And so, before we get into that, we are live from the Pantheon of Pedagogy, the Mecca of Methodology, your vacation from vacation with your Monday morning Mater D's, where you can learn to seriously take teaching not so seriously. This is, and we are, Classroom Hacks.
And I'm Peter Canettis.
I'm Eric Tan. Pedro?
Hey, by the way, I'm not sure if I ever asked you that intro you gave just now, which I like. Did you make that up all by yourself?
Yeah, usually I have everything is pretty much the stockpile, live from the Pantheon of Pedagogy, the Mecca of Methodology, your vacation for vacation, and then that line after that is usually changed. So Monday morning Mater D's is this week's.
That's impressive. Good job.
So, and it's easier when you kind of have the template and you're just switching out one line usually.
Well, I'm honored and privileged to be tagging along with you on this podcast, so thank you for having me.
Well, you have been part of it from the beginning, so without you there...
Yeah, but it's your baby. It's your brainchild.
And now I'd say it's a teenager, because it's a preteen, because we are on episode 12. Next episode it will be a teenager. I can't believe it. 13 episodes.
And they'll always be on their cell phone, and we can't relate to them anymore. We can't reach them.
How do we reach these kids? So, just to kind of start, you get interviewed everywhere you go, whether it's from your very first job to your very last job or to your actual career. You are going to probably go through some sort of interview process. And as we're going along in our culture, we're seeing that interviews and types of interviews are changing, that it's not always going to be a typical sit down with one person across a desk, let me ask you about your qualifications, go through your resumes. Interviews are becoming more engaging. They're becoming more of a show rather than tell sort of process. And before we get into some of that here, Pedro, do you have any sort of experiences or time spent with just interviews in general from maybe your previous jobs before we get into some of our collegiate interview talk?
I do, of course, and I wouldn't say probably, neither of us are experts on this topic. Is that fair to say?
I'd say you probably might have more expertise on it in terms of...
Yeah, because I've been alive longer, maybe. Because of that, right?
But, because you've gone through more interview processes, or because you told me off mic that you have a background in HR, so... I do.
Oh, brother, probably 20 years ago, I spent a couple of years in HR and doing various jobs or various responsibilities, and one of them was as a recruiter. And so I've interviewed hundreds of people and maybe even thousands. But all that to say is you learn a lot of what to do and what not to do on an interview, being on the other side.
That's kind of a good place to maybe branch off. Do you have any sort of insight into what you saw people do during these interviews when you interviewed them? What do you think were beneficial things to do, and what were things that you thought, okay, maybe not bring that to an interview?
The first one that pops in my mind, and I'm sure most people know this, if not all of our listeners, the whole thing about being on time is really important. You're under a time crunch many times for the hiring process. And I mean, I wasn't interviewing teachers. I was interviewing people for various positions at companies, frequently customer service positions. And I even tell my students now in the classroom to give them advice about interviewing for jobs. I tell them, look, be on time. I mean, be early. 9 times out of 10, the hiring manager or the director of HR or the manager of the department would tell me, hey, Pete, as you're interviewing these people, if they're late to the interview, even by a minute, do not pass them along to me. Because they're under a time crunch too. And so if we have 100 people to interview in a week, you look for anything to weed people out because your time
absolutely.
is so, we're all so pressed for time. And so, because as much as I hate to say it, this is the way they think in the interviewing process. If they, 2 things, their behavior in the past at the job or jobs is how they're going to behave with us. And so people who are hiring are looking for patterns. How were they in their past jobs? Now, maybe people change and they improve, and that's very possible. We all do at times. But that's just the way it goes in the marketplace. People we hire, we're going to look at their past behavior, how they were in their past jobs to see how they'll be at this job. And so I even tell students, even those jobs you have at McDonald's or the movie theater or at Foot Locker, those jobs that you have while going through school that are not going to be your career, do well at those jobs because a good record follows you. A good job history follows you, as does a bad job history. What do you think of that?
I would totally agree with all those things you said, especially when you are interviewing for some of your first jobs and not necessarily your careers, whether those are jobs in retail, whether those are jobs in the food industry. Some of these jobs you might get at a younger age. A lot of times, many of these places are looking for areas that you can just sort of fill a niche, like, are you close enough? Are you going to be responsible? Are you going to be able to work these certain hours? And so some of the expectations and criteria aren't necessarily as specific. Now, when we get into the next part of the episode and we start talking about specificity and what certain schools might be looking for, that's when we're going to start talking about what you may need to bring to the table, what you may need to know. Whereas with here, like Pedro said, when you're interviewing a whole bunch of people early on and you're trying to fill 100 spots and you have 1,000 applicants, yes, you're going to need to weed out the field by any way you can before you even get to a resume, before you even get to a one-on-one interview. If you're not showing up on time, if you're not dressed appropriately,
that's a big one too. Yeah, you'd be surprised. I'm sorry to cut you off.
No problem. How
many people would show up to interviews in jeans and a t-shirt or jeans and even a polo or something like that, and you're wondering, great point.
And the reason why those things matter, because some of you might say, well, why do those things matter? It's because if they see that you don't have care for what you're doing, even in an interview, what makes them think you're going to care when you actually get the job? And Pedro, and as we transition here, do you remember any of your early interviews when you first started teaching? What were some of your early interviews like? I
mean, I've always been gregarious, and so there's a part of me that always enjoys interviews because you're talking with people. But we know, interviewing is, even if you like people and even if you like interviews, sometimes or oftentimes it's still nerve-wracking. And so I remember looking back at some of them that I was when my nerves got the best of me, it wasn't a complete disaster, but I would say like a million times in the interview. Or one time someone gave me a Diet Coke or a bottle of water in the interview, and they were very relaxed, but during the interview, I kept sipping from the can, even when the drink was long gone.
So you were just pretending to drink?
Well, it was just nerves.
Sure.
And this is when I was a much younger man, in the beginning of my interviewing career. And I look back and thinking, they saw me sipping from a can that was completely empty for about the last 20 minutes. Mm-hmm. That had to be weird. Yeah,
I recall my first interview when I interviewed for a tutoring position, and I worked in a writing center, and then subsequently became an adjunct at that same school, that I had one of my classmates in graduate school told me about this position as a graduate level tutor, and it was sort of this midway between a professional tutor and a student tutor, and she said, I think you'd be a good candidate, and she just kind of sort of guided me to the writing center director, and I talked with the writing center director, and it wasn't a very formal interview, but I think based on the credibility of my classmate, it got me the job. And the interview for when I became an adjunct at my first school wasn't actually an interview either. They were short on adjuncts, and the chair at the time came up, said, "Can you work these classes during the fall?" And I said yes, and she gave me the contract, and I signed right there. Now, I tell you the story because that's not necessarily indicative of how every interview process is going to go. However, one thing that you should keep an eye out for, especially for those of you who might be looking to do adjunct work or work at multiple schools, is that when certain colleges do have shortages, or people retire or people don't return, they need to fill those. And a lot of times with adjuncts, you're not necessarily always going to go through a very lengthy or extensive interview process. You'll get interviewed, you'll get asked your regular questions, but it's not always going to be as inextensive as like a lectureship or a full-time position. So my advice to you is to go out there, see what sort of positions are available, how many might be available, and if it's something where you potentially want to try to get in somewhere where you might not have enough experience yet, try to look for those, because they will hire an adjunct more likely, even if you don't necessarily have as much experience in your particular field, opposed if you were trying to go for like a full-time job right off the bat.
So you're telling me that first teaching job you got, they hired you without even checking anything of your transcripts or anything like that?
Right, correct.
Because, that's great. That's a great story.
Because I had credit for the tutoring position, I had credibility from my classmate, and then from the adjunct position, the writing center director was my reference. So they kind of just took her at her word. And so that was one of those things where it was more of just, he can fill this need, so let's put him in there.
Yeah, likewise. One of the colleges I worked at, it was very similar, not completely. She did interview me, but then by the end she just hired me, and it was the same situation. They were under a time crunch. They needed people to fill some classes, and the semester was starting very quickly. And so after they hired me and after the semester started, then they were able to check my for transcripts, for the official transcripts and everything. And of course everything turned out okay, but it was just funny being hired so quickly like that, and it makes you feel good, but then at the same time you're like, I didn't get the full interview experience.
Mm-hmm. And as we sort of talked about in the previous episode with failure, why it might, like Pedro said, might feel good that you just got the job right off the bat, but when you actually have to do an interview, it's good to go through as many interviews as you can, because interviews themselves are a process.
Yeah.
And the more you can do, the more you can learn from them. And if you don't get the job right away, that's fine. Take notes from your interview. Do callbacks to ask if you can talk with anyone to see what you might have done wrong. And when we
feedback.
Yeah, feedback for sure. And when we come back from our break, that's what we're going to be talking about and get into the specifics of a college level interview, what you might expect and what you need to prepare for, and what you can actually do in the interview to separate yourself from the pack. And we'll talk about that after this commercial break. Hello everyone, just wanted to remind all of our wonderful listeners that you can find exclusive Classroom Hacks content on our respective social media platforms. You can find daily advice, information, motivation, and hilarity, all for free. So find, follow, like, and enjoy Classroom Hacks on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we are back. So for this half of the episode, we are going to get a bit more specific with the interview process at a college level. And I'll start off by saying that when I went for a second adjunct position, I came to find that it wasn't anything like the very first adjunct position that I applied for when I went to go to my work at a secondary school. And I don't mean secondary in terms of like secondary ed, but a different college. I actually sat down with the department chair, and it's not so much that she asks your qualifications or anything of that nature, but you have to sort of be able to talk about what you might bring to class. What is your pedagogy like? What are some of your methods that you might use? What are some of the areas that you might do differently than opposed to maybe some traditional practices? At least that what was in my interview. And one of the things that I learned from that particular interview, especially going into it, was to first and foremost do your research. know what that particular department might be looking for and know what they might be lacking. Also try to figure out exactly what the direction of the particular school might be, because some schools might have more traditional approaches, some schools might be more progressive, other schools might try to be more experiential. And so if you can figure out where you might fit into that, then it gives you a better chance to sort of respond to the interview questions, and it gives them a better idea of how you actually fit into their particular mold. And because say you go to a school where they're much more progressive and you come in with a very traditional background, you have very particular habits that might be a little older or closer to how you were taught from older teachers, and right off the bat they're going to know this particular person or this particular applicant doesn't necessarily fit into our program, and so it's easier for them to weed you out at that level. And so one of the things to do that I would recommend is trying to research where exactly you're going and what their particular needs are and how you specifically might fit into those needs. What about you, Pedro? Can you give us any insight into some of your interview processes and what you succeeded at that you feel got you the job?
Yeah, to piggyback on what you just said, do research on the school itself. Spend time researching them on their website, look at their mission statement, their values, the purposes of the school, and see where you fit in. One interview I had, I looked at the school, and in their mission statement, in their list of values, I found some values they had that I could have written them. What I mean is they had some things written down. I'm like, oh my goodness, that's why I teach. One school said, here at this college, we believe in the value of, let me think how they said it, the power of knowledge and teaching and the value of learning for the sake of knowledge. I'm thinking, wait a minute, if this is what they really think, I want to be here because that's what I think. So find out, are you like-minded with the school, and find out where you are like-minded, and in the interview show that you know something about the school, and it's not just a job interview. You're thinking, this is a place I really want to be. And the other thing is, I would add, is if I had to give one piece of advice, I mean, what you just said and the thing about researching the school are so important, but the one piece of advice I would give, and I'm not saying it's the most important, but is practice, practice, practice. It's so easy to find online interview questions for a college faculty position and even list the discipline, because the more you prepare your answers, I mean your honest answers, the more you practice the questions, the better you'll be in the interview. Mm-hmm. And this is, I mean, it's common sense, right? Practice, practice, practice if we want to get better at something, because we don't want to rely just off the cuff, because sometimes we just forget. It's in a room. It's nerve-wracking. Sometimes the people, you don't feel the same as when you're just with buddies. Obviously, it's an interview process. But the more you practice, the more confidence we have going into the interview, the more articulate we sound. And I mean, sometimes even they'll ask a question that I hadn't prepared for, but because I practiced so many different types of questions, mm-hmm. I was able to answer it because it overlapped with a lot of things that I did prepare for. Yeah. And so I was, you'll find yourself in a position where you're much less likely to be stumped, much less likely to be
caught off guard.
Yeah, caught off guard, and in a much better position to give an answer that really is you and shows that you love teaching, you want to work there, and you are a student of your craft, and you know what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. I think the idea of practice is paramount, especially as we brought up earlier in the episode. Why going to multiple interviews is not a bad thing. And even if you don't get the job the first, second, or third time, why interviews are beneficial is because it allows you to practice. It allows you to get experience in the different types of interview processes that there might be. One example I'll give you is that when I did an interview for a lectureship position, the interview was very different than my interview was for my adjunct position. It was not as formal. It was a very informal type interview. It was very conversational, if anything. And we didn't really talk specifically about what is your pedagogy, this, that. It was more about give me a specific thing that you do in class. Give me a specific project. Give me a specific sort of lesson plan. How did your students react to that lesson plan? What did you gain from it when you reflected on it? And so it was much more pointed. It was much more accurate. But at the same time, just the overall tone was more laid back. And that's what threw me off the very first lectureship position I applied for. But when I didn't get it, I put that into my archive and I said, I have to prepare for any type of interview that might be thrown my way. When I worked in retail, I had interviews that were in front of 3 or 4 people, and then, where you're just standing and people are sitting at a desk. And then I've had interviews where it was just me and one person behind a desk. And so each time you interview, you get a different sort of experience. And if you reflect on that and you take notes and you think about what that was like, the next time you see an interview like that, as Pedro said, you are much more prepared for it as well. In terms of the actual process, Pedro most recently has stepped up in the world, and he went through a very long and extensive interview process. Would you mind sort of giving some insight into what that process was like for some of the people who might be getting poised to go for a full-time interview process or a different full-time process?
Yeah, recently I went through an interview process for a teaching position that was, for me, the most, to this point, the most extensive in terms of the number of interviews and the number of people I met with. And yeah, it was, you're always going to meet with the search committee, which typically consists of the majority of the people are from that department that you're in. And then also 1 or 2 people from the outside. They always want to bring in an outside voice from a different department. So for me, it was mostly philosophy faculty in the interview, and then they brought in an English professor just to, again, have an outside view. And they took turns. And they were taking notes, and so they would ask different questions, and different committee members would jump in and follow up with questions that another person asked. And there was a teaching demonstration, of course. And by the way, that's something that's really, if you can, find out, because some schools have it where you actually teach students in an actual class, but oftentimes you end up teaching the search committee, and you have to act as if they're the students or treat them like the students. And that can be sometimes a bit more difficult, because along with teaching, you're adding like acting skills on it, because you realize it's somewhat of an artificial situation. They're not the actual students. And the nice thing is, anytime I've been in that situation, the people are always game. I mean, the search committee and the people that are involved, they're always very willing to participate and go along with it. And they give you their best, which has been nice. And so we had the teaching demonstration, and then just further interviews with, some of them were face-to-face. I had one that was through Skype. Yeah, it's a lot of the questions overlapped, but as you talk to different people, they're going to hit, of course, areas and questions that you weren't asked in the previous, which obviously is the point. So again, just to, if I may beat the same drum or to beat a dead horse, however they say it, the thing that really helped me the most was I just prepared. Even when I was sick of answering the questions on my own, like I'd be at home and my wife would see me muttering to myself, or sometimes I had her play the interviewer. As tedious as that might become, it's an old military expression: the more you sweat in training, the less you'll bleed in battle. And so the more you practice, the better you'll be. And go to different websites. I went to a lot of .edu websites for interview questions, and I went to probably 10 of them. And because a lot of these questions do overlap that you'll find on these websites, but some of them I would come across and be like, oh, that's a good question. The other websites weren't asking that question. So do your research practice, and you'll be so happy you did.
I would say that the research and the practice part help with the execution of it, especially just because at the end of the day, the interview is really just a hard sell. You're trying to sell yourself as this individual who can accomplish what your lesson plan sets out to do, and you can do it well. And the more you do it, the more confident you are, because it's essentially habitual at that point, that even if you get a question that might throw you off, it shouldn't hinder how you do what you do, because you've done it so many times at this point. One thing I do want to ask, Pedro, as we are nearing the end of this episode, is are there any sort of failures or weaknesses that you want to sort of talk about in terms of interviews, whether your own or others, that you've seen that you think would be beneficial for the audience to know about?
One that sounds quirky and a little weird And I learned this by firsthand experience as a recruiter during my days in HR, and then just by talking to other people. This is a very small thing, but you'd be surprised on how much it makes a difference. And you can disagree with me on this, that's fine. Maybe your experience has been otherwise, and not just you, Eric, but anyone who's listening. Don't shake the hand of the interviewer unless they put their hand out first.
That's interesting.
Yeah, because sometimes I'd be interviewing people during cold and flu season. So a lot of people come in with the sniffles, and it was kind of weird. People would be blowing their nose on a consistent basis, these people coming in. Mm-hmm. And then you're shaking, they put their hand out, and you're thinking, you just were blowing your nose into that. Now, I know this sounds weird and funny, but a lot of people a lot of people, meaning on the side of the interviewer, are turned off by that. Mm-hmm. Now, people out there might be disagreeing with that, and that's fine. But what I did find was, let them dictate that. If they put their hand out, by all means, shake it confidently, firmly, look at them in the eye, smile. We know those things. But that was just a little quirk that sometimes will throw off the interviewer or make you or put you or set you on the wrong step from the beginning. Mm-hmm. And again, it's a weird thing, but it's just, I'm trying to think of something that you might not read about or hear about in a typical advice column about interviews.
Sure. You know, I heard a great piece of advice, a couple of pieces of advice when I talked with an administrator not too long ago about some of the things he saw in recent interviews, and he gave me some advice that has stuck with me. And so he told me about two interviewees that he had, two applicants that he had, and he said, remember these things. Be mindful about confidence and being cocky, but also be mindful about humility and passivity. And so this is where it came into play. The person who interviewed first, when she went through her interview, she went through the entire thing, and one of the things he said stuck out to him the most was that she consistently reiterated the point, I'm just so happy for this opportunity. Thank you for having me. Anything that you need from me, I will do. And he said there's absolutely nothing wrong with being humble. But the problem with that was that she didn't necessarily incorporate her value to the particular place she was interviewing. And the fact that she was just happy for the opportunity didn't necessarily separate her from the rest of the pack, people who were hungry, people who knew exactly what they could bring to the table, and people who knew how they fit into the program. When you're just happy for the opportunity, a lot of times the department might just look at you and say, okay, this is someone who doesn't really have direction and is waiting for direction. The thing he told me that stuck out the most was he said, you either live by your sword or you die by your sword, but you have to have a sword, because otherwise you're just like everybody else. And why that's significant is because, say for instance, you're going into a school that is very tech savvy and you have experience with media in terms of either podcasting or video essays, video editing, and that's your sword. You live by that. You sell that sword, you sell that bit of technology and expertise that you have, and you show them how it fits into what they're doing. And whether they give you the job or not, you know exactly how well you are working with that. You're not just happy to be there, but you're showing how you can be a contributor and how you can impact that particular position. And when you do that well enough, you come off confident, but you don't come off cocky, because it shows you know what you're talking about, and it shows that you've done your research. So like I said, any advice that I can give is remember those things. Try to stay within that balance of confidence and humble, but not to the sense of just being happy to be there, because you want to show them you know exactly what you can contribute and how you fit in to their overall scheme of things.
Yeah, it's a great piece of advice, and makes my don't shake their hand first advice seem so small. Yours was much more profound. I like it.
But the don't shake their hand reminds me of a story I heard about two people who went on an interview one time, and the person doing the interview brought them out to a restaurant, and they ordered their food, and the first person took some salt and put it on their food, and the second person cut their food, ate it, and then put salt on it. At the end of the interview, the person hired the second person because he said well, why did you hire me? And he said, because you checked to see if you needed salt first. You paid attention to detail, whereas the other person just assumed that the dish needed salt and could have already been salty enough. So
is this a true story?
It was an old anecdote I heard from
okay.
someone a long time ago. And, and I mean, obviously not all interviews are like that, but whether it's something that you think is slight or whether it's something that you think is grandiose when it comes to interviews, take notes of everything, because like we talked about earlier, the more you have in your archive, the more you've stored and recognize, the easier it will be for you to respond during the actual interview.
What's your protocol for following up after an interview? Do you do it by email? Do you send a handwritten note? What do you do?
I think in this day and age, I've done usually email. Sometimes, depending on how far I got with the interview process, I might actually call and email. But usually it's an email just asking, is there anything, advice you can give? Is there any time we might be able to meet and talk in person so I know what I could do to better polish my CV, to better approach my next interview?
Did you really ask them to meet in person?
Yes.
Have they ever met you in person?
In fact, I'm meeting one person in person in August, and another person didn't meet me in person, but they did email me back.
Good for you. I mean, that's great. That's a great example of you ask, and the worst they can do is say no.
Exactly.
That's a great example.
How about you? What is your process for getting feedback?
Yeah, it's again, you do research online on this, and many will say a follow-up by email is fine. Some will say a handwritten note is better. Some will say a handwritten note is not as effective. So, but the through line is always follow up quickly.
Yeah.
I think it helps you to stand out. You get to maybe even reiterate something that you mentioned in the interview, or maybe mention something that you didn't have a chance to say, or something that they didn't ask, to remind them why you want to work there and why you think you're a good fit for the position. So that's really important. The other thing I wanted to ask you about was, and this doesn't always happen, I'm surprised, and it just hasn't always been asked, but it is still on the list of regular questions that you will be asked in an interview, is what are your weaknesses, or what are areas which you can improve? Mm-hmm. And the old joke is when people say, what are your weaknesses? The old joke is, I care too much about my students. That's my weakness. Now, we don't want to give that type of answer. So what do you think is a good answer that is truthful, but yet is not going to make you look bad or look like a bad teacher?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's a great setup. And I think if we reflect back on the episode about failure, then what you can do is you can think about a time in class or a lesson plan that you've done that you've worked on and you improved on, and take that and formulate your response around that. So for instance, if my response was in regards to when I forgot my flash drive and I said, one of my failures was early on in my career, I did too many things at once and it caused me to get overwhelmed, or it caused me to be more forgetful. However, the way I improved upon that was to become more organized, and this is how I became more organized, and through that, it allowed me to become a better educator. It allowed me to become more available for my students because I was able to regulate my time a lot better. And so if you take something that that you aren't afraid to talk about, and you already know how you did improve on it, it makes the story a lot easier to recall and to talk about to the person you're being interviewed by.
That's a great point. And that's, again, in all the research and so many advice or pieces on interview advice or books that talk about interviewing, they say the same thing in terms of give a true weakness, but tell them and show them, again, be honest. I mean, don't give this answer if this is not what we're really doing. Is show them how you are working on it, or have worked on it, or how you've improved on it. Because everyone has weaknesses. Mm-hmm. Everyone has points that they can improve on. We all do. But show that we are taking the steps to be proactive to turn it into a strength or to improve on the weakness. So, yeah, great point.
Well, Pedro, I think we've covered quite a bit for this interview episode. Thank you for your insight as someone who was working in HR, because I think that was great perspective to have. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we bon voyage out of here?
At this point, I'm just going to say thank you, Eric, for running the show as usual.
And with that note, we will see you next time. Adios, everybody.